after I caught my woman with my roommate cheating on me. Well, at least you didn't marry her. I heard this consolation a lot over the next few years, but it provided absolutely no comfort to me at all. We might not yet have stood up in front of the preacher and said, "I do," but in my heart I was already tied to her, and the breakup was at least as bad for me as a true divorce would have been. But I'm already starting at the wrong place in this story, but anyways, this was how it happened. I had just returned to civilization after spending nearly 2 years in Japan with the Air Force, and I was now stationed fairly close to home at Melchett AFB in San Antonio, Texas. I was young and enthusiastic about life, and was looking forward to finishing up my last military assignment there with as little fuss and bother as possible. I liked my job as an Air Force cop, but I had plans for a long and successful post-USAF career which didn't include doing 20 or even more. I had always wanted to be a cop as a kid, but by the time I was out of high school and ready to apply at our local city police academy, I already knew that my odds of becoming one were pretty long. Our current mayor was trying to trim, with a huge axe, the city budget, mostly on the backs of the fire and police and other service departments, and had cut the number of new cadet classes for each far beyond the bone. New candidates were also now expected to have at least 2 years of college and other outside law enforcement experience before even being possibly considered. Needless to say, they weren't accepting wet behind the ears 18-year-olds this week. It also goes without saying that within a few years our city now suddenly developed one of the highest crime rates and poorest fire and EMS response times in the nation. The budget never did get fixed, the savings got blown for other pie-in-the-sky projects, and our city services became a national joke. I heard that new mayors over a decade later were still trying to fix the problems their predecessor had created, but that's not really related to my story. I needed both some college and some practical experience. I had no luck getting on with the local sheriff's department either, so I picked the next best thing. I joined the Air Force and was approved for my first choice, law enforcement. This certainly beat the alternative of SP, security police, that usually meant standing guard duty out on some airplane hangar, runway, or bomb storage bunker, usually in the rain and snow. The job wasn't too bad, but it's never really fun to be a junior enlisted person in any career field. There seemed to always be something urgent happening that would require us to work 12-hour shifts without a day off for a week or two, so I didn't get much playtime or get to see much of Japan off base. I did have a very understanding NCOIC, top enlisted boss of my section, who was very pro-education and extremely supportive of young airmen that were more interested in taking night college classes than drinking beer every night at the Airmen's Club. He made it clear with my supervisor that I would always be able to take a few hours off to attend my classes even if we were in the middle of a base alert or working some long extended shift. Returning to the States for my next assignment, I found that things were a little bit different. Melchett AFB at the time was one of the largest bases we had, but my unit was stationed in a remote annex of the base up on Security Hill out in the middle of nowhere. Shuttle buses to the main part of the base ran irregularly and far between, and for all practical purposes, even with a car, if you were stationed there you were pretty much trapped. Even the nearest branch of the local community college was not close enough to be convenient. Worse, my new work schedule rotated duty shifts every month, which made taking any educational classes virtually impossible. The new job wasn't bad, but it wasn't nearly as much fun as at my last base. I had been used to duties being rotated about so that everyone got to do a little of everything: disturbance calls to base housing or dorms, traffic control, admin/base ops, some of everything. But here on Security Hill, everything was 100% boring routine. I would sit at a desk every day and check security badges going in and out of our main building, and dealing with the mountains of paperwork generated by anything else that is entering or leaving the building. Boring was a vast understatement. Even our enlisted dorm was usually dead quiet, with usually nothing interesting ever occurring. My roommate Jordan usually went clubbing every weekend, but as his tastes ran to country and Western music and I preferred 70s Brit progressive, I didn't often join him at first. Eventually the boredom of either just working or staying in my dorm room gradually changed my mind, and on one late weekend evening I joined Jordan clubbing and met Vicky, as the Beatles song goes, and then I saw her standing there. She was about my age and standing in a corner of the club with a girlfriend, nursing a drink. She seemed rather out of place and not particularly into the music either. Another fellow had asked her to dance earlier and she had accepted, but plainly didn't know how the dance steps went and had to improvise badly. He spent the remaining dances with her girlfriend instead, and she began to look increasingly bored and restless. She wasn't a conventional beauty, but she had something about her that made her stand out from the other, better dressed and dolled up for a woman in the club. She looked like someone's lost kid sister, the proverbial girl next door who had made a wrong turn somewhere and ended up badly lost in some strange and not entirely friendly new world. Her hair was long and in my favorite auburn brown color, but appeared a little lifeless, as did her cheeks. She was apparently wearing very little, if any, makeup, and her skin appeared to be a little sallow and blotchy, as if maybe she hadn't been very well lately. She was quite tall and thin, but appeared to hunch her shoulders down a bit, as if she were trying to become less conspicuous to hide better into the woodwork. Still, despite the many surface defects, she had something. As her girlfriend was now busy dancing on the dance floor, I decided that I at least wanted to talk to her. "Hi, since neither of us seems likely to be dancing anytime soon, I thought I might as well try and help you hold up this part of the wall." Not particularly witty or clever, but it was vaguely original and had the obvious merit of sincerity behind it. She gave me a weak smile but didn't try to escape. We chatted for a bit about what music we did like, definitely not what the C&W Club was playing, and compared favorite bands. She liked heavy metal music, especially AC/DC and Ozzy, and had never even heard of my favorites, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Yes, and the Grateful Dead. We compromised on our only overlapping band, Led Zeppelin. An hour later, we were having a late dinner/early breakfast at a nearby Denny's, and traded life stories until about 4 in the morning over endless orders of English muffins, which she ate as if she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Actually, she really hadn't. She was staying with some friends sharing an apartment, and none of them had the money lately for buying much in the way of groceries. She had a part-time job working as a hostess at a local restaurant, but the pay was not very good at all, and she didn't get a cut of the tips either. I saw her again the next Friday night, and we had intended to go out to a decent restaurant for dinner and then go see a movie, but we got badly distracted when briefly visiting my dorm room, and we never made it out of bed until after 10 p.m. Sleepovers in the dorm by members of the opposite sex were a major no-no, and although the odds were very low on getting caught, many guys routinely did it. I didn't feel particularly lucky at the moment, so we grudgingly got dressed and had another late night dinner out at Denny's. The sex had been really good. Neither of us were virgins, but we'd both been badly out of circulation for a while. It just felt special between us, and the more we were with each other, the harder it became to say good night. We started calling each other nightly and even managed a few quickies during the week until my work schedule did its monthly change and I moved from day shift to swings. Being on swings actually helped our love life. She would get off work about 10 p.m. and take the bus to our favorite Denny's and wait for me to get off of work and get there at about 12:15 a.m. I'd grab a bite to eat and we'd then go to her apartment, make love, and I'd crash there most nights and only return to my dorm room to shower, shave, and put on a clean uniform before going into work the next day at 3 p.m. It only took me about 3 weeks of this routine to decide that I wanted to marry her, and while she was a little reluctant when I asked her, she didn't say no. I pushed for a fairly short engagement and a quick wedding, but she dragged her feet and had numerous minor excuses for why we shouldn't rush. Her standard fallback excuse was that things had been a bit rough for her lately, and she was still trying to get her head screwed back on straight. I should have recognized this for the warning that it was and backed off a bit, slowing things down until she became a little more comfortable. She tended to have a very nervous disposition, and she became distracted, frustrated, or frazzled very easily with only minor provocation. Her mood began wildly swinging in big up and down cycles that ought to have given me other warnings. She also began to alternate between being hyper-affectionate and clingy, which I admit liking sometimes, to being very standoffish and even averse to being kissed or touched at all times. Other times she would be so jittery that she couldn't even sit down. She would talk incessantly and so fast I could hardly understand a word she was saying. In a phase like this, she would go for 2 to 3 days seemingly without stopping, let alone sleeping. That should have been yet another warning, of a different kind. I admit I didn't know very much about women, and could figure out even less why she was suddenly acting so very odd. In the end, I just attributed everything to engagement nerves and decided, belatedly, to give her a little bit more space to cool things down enough so that she wouldn't have a complete breakdown before the wedding. The final date, however, remained still much under debate. I was on my last day of swing shift when I got a strange and fateful phone call at work at about 6:30 p.m. from my credit union. One of the few nice things about working up on Security Hill was there was a branch of the local military credit union 2 buildings down from my dorm building that handled all of my military pay via direct deposit, made low-interest car and house loans for military personnel much better than the national chain banks, and even offered us an ultra-low interest rate Visa card. Since I was now back in the States and needed something for emergency use, only I signed up for one, at the time when I set up my other accounts. As a security measure, I checked the box that said this would be an infrequent use card and gave them the right to investigate any and all transactions made on the card, and I gave them my duty phone and dorm room phone numbers for immediate contact. In those days before electronic verification and when most places took a carbon imprint of your card, stolen credit card numbers were epidemic, as they still are. At least once a week while in Japan, I would have to file a stolen credit card report for other service members that had been victimized, and I was determined that it wouldn't happen to me. But apparently it had. The agent from customer service was asking me if I had just checked into the Caesar Hotel off of I-10 in San Antonio. Definitely not. I checked my wallet and found that my Visa card was indeed gone. Also, the nearly $180 I thought I had in my wallet was now missing. The girl at customer service didn't have any other records of its recent use, but most places didn't call or have electronic means of verification of a card, so that didn't exclude the possibility that my card had been already used in other places all over town. I asked for and received a callback number to her and got a fraud case number before hanging up on her to report the situation to the San Antonio police. My direct boss, a quite useless second lieutenant, aren't they all, didn't want to excuse me from the remainder of my shift, but he couldn't prevent me from calling up our company first sergeant to get our CO to overrule him. 15 minutes later, I was on a dinner break and on my way to the Caesar Hotel, where it was confirmed by the desk clerk that he had checked in about an hour ago. More specifically, a young couple had checked in about an hour ago under my name and using my credit card. After I proved who I was and declared that my card had been stolen and used fraudulently, the clerk got the evening manager, who was quite helpful, and called SAPD to dispatch some officers to arrest the thieves. The responding officer, a middle-aged Hispanic female, took down all of my information. It helped that I was a member of ELI and still in uniform, and after getting another key to my room, we went up and I opened the door for her. The couple we had expected to find were not in immediate sight. They were showering together in the bathroom at the moment, but they had apparently been quite busy. There were at least 6 department store shopping bags on the floor and a large bag from a local liquor store chain on the table. In clear sight in the room on dresser were some cigarettes and drinks. At least, I thought, the department store purchases can probably all be returned okay, so the potential financial damage didn't seem to be too bad. The worst part was finding out who the culprits were: Vicky and my roommate Jordan. I admit now that my own life was saved by some miraculous accident. I had inexplicably left my .38 service revolver lying on my desk back at work. Technically, it was a mandatory part of my uniform that I wore it at all times, and I couldn't remember ever having taken it out of my holster and just leaving anywhere, let alone on a desk. This was an unspeakably rookie mistake that no junior ELI member would have ever made, but today it saved their lives. I swear, the second I saw them coming nude out of the shower to see what the noise and fuss was about, my hand went to my empty holster. I haven't the slightest doubt that I would have fired my weapon and killed them both on the spot. I knew at that very moment what otherwise insane urges drive husbands to shoot their wives or their lovers when caught by surprise in the fact. But for the happy accident of leaving my gun, Vicky and Jordan would have undoubtedly met that fate, and instead it would have been me in handcuffs and awaiting murder charges. Neither of them was very happy to see me, and they were even less happy about being taken away in handcuffs in the back of a squad car. Seeing Vicky's look of abject shame and hearing her cry all of the way just crushed my soul even further. The arresting officer seemed to think that I was in no mental condition to deal with the situation any further, and pretty much ordered me back to base to do whatever reporting I needed to do there and let SAPD do their end of the job. With nothing left to do, I returned to work for the remainder of my shift. In the morning, I filed a theft report for the stolen credit card at the main LE office on the main part of the base and parked myself in a chair in front of my first sergeant's office at 7:59 the next morning and gave him a complete and unvarnished statement of the facts. He ground his teeth a bit but didn't find any fault with my actions, even my leaving a firearm unattended, albeit in a secure area, and he ordered me excused from all duties for the next 3 days and to go to the clinic and take a drug test and then go get some sleep. Jordan was released from Behar County Jail after about 2 days, but I never saw him again. He faced a nice collection of UCMJ charges, which also included amphetamine use and dealing. A FOSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, tore up our dorm room and found even more drugs in his locker and in his car. He wisely pled out on the mercy of the judge and got a slightly reduced sentence at a Fed holding pen that wasn't named Leavenworth. He also got a dishonorable discharge, loss of all stripes and pay, all the usual penalties. I did hear later that he successfully appealed to be allowed to remain in the service, and he started all over again as an E1, finishing up his career eventually working in the social actions group teaching about drug and alcohol abuse. I spent far more time the next 6 months dealing with OSI than I would have liked. They tended to assume every airman was guilty unless proven innocent. I must have spent over 100 hours being questioned and signing statements there, but I was eventually cleared of any involvement with Jordan's drug dealing. My service record remained clean, but that was a rather weak silver lining compared to the storm cloud of my breakup with Vicky. Vicky faced only civilian charges, and those were mostly only misdemeanors for the theft and fraud charges, but she was soon in much bigger trouble for methamphetamine possession charges. I also soon found out that she had an existing felony check fraud warrant on her from another county. In fact, the ADA handling her case told me at our first meeting that Vicky had been in constant trouble with the law for at least the last 5 years since she became a legal adult. She had previously stolen money from her family, but those charges had been dropped shortly afterwards. There was a sealed juvie record for her also that neither the ADA nor I ever did get to see. But the conclusion was obvious that Vicky was a very screwed-up young lady with a long history of drug abuse. Apparently, she had tried somewhat to go clean since I had met her, but the pressure to use had become too strong for her. I refused to pay the money for her bail on the advice of the ADA that the extra time spent in county lockup before the trial hearing would be the best thing for her right now, if she really wanted to get herself off of drugs. I didn't quite agree with her logic, but she did really seem to have her best interests at heart and wasn't just gunning for a slam-dunk conviction. Vicky stayed in jail, and I tried to get on with my life. When all of the expenses had been totaled, Vicky and Jordan had run up over $1,400 in their drug-induced wild shopping spree, but I was able to get most of the department store items returned in my Visa account fully credited, except for the $46 they spent at the liquor store, the $79 for the hotel room, and a $135 room service charge for a champagne dinner. In my opinion, the hotel had done everything correctly and by the book and had actually taken the time to verify my card, so I didn't feel it was right to penalize them for being honest, and I paid those bills myself. At this point, losing just a little over $500 total, including the $180 in cash, was a miracle I was more than happy to accept. Vicky pled guilty to all counts, but asked if I would visit her before sentencing. I refused. I was trying desperately to cut her out of my life and memories as if she were a cancer. It didn't work. Supposedly it never does. I was also very guilt-stricken over the fact that I had lost so much emotional control upon finding her in that hotel room, and that I could and would have killed her if I had been carrying my revolver as I should have been. I just couldn't trust my emotions if I were to speak with her in jail. I'd probably end up doing something foolish like dropping all of the theft and fraud charges. The drug charges would still be there, though, and forgiving her entirely, until the next time she went on a wild drug binge. It was safer for me, I thought, to just try and forget her entirely. I didn't go to her sentencing, but the ADA later called me up to tell me that she accepted the offered plea and received a term of 7 to 12 years in a state prison with a promise of early parole if she completed the drug treatment program and at least a year of counseling afterwards. She offered to provide me with contact information for which prison Vicky had been sent to, but I declined and told her I had no further interest in her welfare. And I didn't, nor did I start to show much interest in my own welfare. My last 6 months of duty in San Antonio were frankly nearly more than I could bear. My dickwad lieutenant held a grudge that I had gone up the chain over his head, and tried to make my life hell in the 1,000 little ways that the ass pimple of a second lieutenant boss can. I was up for automatic promotion from E3 senior airman to sergeant, also still E3 so no pay raise. The Air Force does a number of really odd and stupid things like this that are nearly impossible to explain to civilians, but my boss would keep canceling my schedule to attend NCO training school, locally held. On base and theoretically immune from normal organization unit bullshit, but not 100% so. My boss was watching me like a hawk and looking for every trivial and petty write-up on me that he could gig me for, and seemed determined that he was going to ruin my career. After the third time in 6 months that I received a bullshit LOR, letter of reprimand, that I was certain that I hadn't deserved, I decided that I had nothing to lose by going again to the first sergeant's office. I unloaded my gripes upon him for a while, but I got the feeling that as I was short, only about 3 months left to go in my enlistment, and had not filed plans for re-up-ing, his options were fairly limited. He wasn't going to go about making trouble in the chain of command for a 3-striper who wasn't going to even be around much longer, but I do give him credit that he could tell that something else was wrong with me that someone else could fix. I can't order you to go talk to a chaplain, but I'd take it as a special favor if you would do so. Any of them. Take your pick. Then come back and talk to me next week. We didn't have a chaplain up here on Security Hill. The closest one to us, in fact, was a Lutheran pastor who had apparently drawn the short straw and had a small office on the ass end of the flight line, and was thus marginally closer to us than the main base chapels. I liked him, however, at once. He was a huge Norse-Swede blend from somewhere in Minnesota with both psychology and divinity degrees, and had the laid-back Northern Lutheran act down to a science. I told him of my story with Vicky, and he seemed to hit upon all of the significant details at once, even noticing that as I told the story of their discovery in the hotel that my hand again was on my pistol holster. Reluctantly and bit by bit, I told him about how I had actually wanted to kill them, and how only luck or providence had spared them. We ended up meeting for an hour every day for a week until I realized a great truth about myself. Since my guilt over nearly firing my weapon at the woman I had loved, I now had great trouble even putting the holster on, let alone firing it. When I had originally done my weapon qualification with the .38, I had shot a 297 out of 300, easily enough to qualify for the Small Arms Expert badge. At my most recent trip to the range I had done far worse, barely a 140, and I had many misses. The guilt was eating deeply into me, and worse things would undoubtedly start to happen unless I started to deal with them. It was clear, however, that I was no longer happy being an LE and wearing a gun that I was now psychologically nearly incapable of using, even in self-defense. My choices were clear: cross-train into something else or get out of the service. Frankly, the cross-training idea sounded pretty good. Can you type? My chaplain friend asked, and I could. Pretty well, actually. He told me about possibly being a chaplain assistant and joked that I could then type up all of his paperwork for him. We had a good laugh, and I admitted that there were probably worse things. It's hard to cross-train out of LE under normal circumstances. Like the SP folks, we don't have a particularly good retention rate, and the behavior standards are a bit stricter than in most AF skill classifications. Also, there has to be openings in your grade for the skill you want to train into. Usually, this meant a generally sucker job compared to the one you already have, like sitting in a missile silo somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I was lucky, however, and with the help of my first sergeant, I managed to get a release from out of LE and into the chaplain assistant training program at Maxwell AFB, where I re-enlisted for another 4 years. I found I liked the new job, and it had a great number of connections with traditional law enforcement, crisis and suicide intervention, emergency stress management, domestic disputes, hostage situations, plane crashes, and normal deaths were a common part of the job, and I became very good at it. The job was really a whole lot more than being a glorified church secretary, and I probably spent a dozen hours helping handle problems over the telephone or in person for every hour I'd spend typing up reports or anything remotely related to a sermon. Besides, by the time I made staff sergeant and later tech sergeant, I had secretaries that worked for me to do that sort of thing. Not being terribly religious wasn't actually much of a drawback. In fact, nowhere in my job description did it say that I even had to attend any services ever at all, but I had to know what was going on at all of them to better coordinate their after-church activities. As my new career progressed at most bases, I soon became the senior NOIC and managing a staff that supported numerous different chaplains of all different faiths, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. Some days it would be the Baptist minister on call at 3 a.m. when a plane crashed, or Airman Smith came home drunk and angry enough to start beating her spouse. Or it could be the Methodist, or the Catholic priest, or even sometimes the rabbi that would be called at home. And then I'd be the next person called. It didn't much matter. They all had the same call to duty and did the job equally well. I never had the slightest problem with any of them. The crisis work was important and extremely fulfilling to me, but as I worked my way into the final half of my 20-year military career, I started to take more pleasure in the more mundane aspects, handling youth groups and various outreach programs especially. I didn't drink much anymore. I do still enjoy an occasional glass of red wine, but it suddenly became more important to me to help co-host the base AA meetings with the social actions folks and even worked a bit on the side with off-base Narconon programs that always seemed to have a few below-the-radar military members attending. The military has always been a bit hypocritical about this. Being a drunk is almost expected and not punished too terribly severely, but if a young airman gets caught with a joint, things can get a bit hysterical. Folks seeking help for heavier dependencies, the smart ones anyway, try to take their troubles off base for help to avoid having their career destroyed. I finished up my last tour of duty back in San Antonio again, this time at Fort Wayne AFB, where the Air Force does its basic training and has quite a few technical schools and its largest hospital, Wilford Hall. I was the senior enlisted person managing a staff that numbered in the hundreds and handled tens of thousands of people every day. I had younger NCOs to handle the 3 a.m. phone calls these days, but I tried hard to keep my fingers on the pulse of things and handled my share of the personal tragedies. I had made Senior Master Sergeant some time back and had the offer of making Chief Master Sergeant dangling in front of me, but I had decided that I'd done my 20 and it was getting near time to move on and do something else in life. Plus, once you make Chief, E9 the top enlisted rank, everything starts to become military politics. Sooner or later my widening ass would end up sitting somewhere in the Pentagon advising senior officers about what policies we should be enacting for the future, and that didn't even sound remotely like fun to me. I had never married. Frankly, I hadn't even been much tempted. The people I tended to meet every day were all the ones with issues of some kind or another, and that's certainly not conducive to finding a mate. The women I'd meet off base were usually from other church groups or organizations with which I would coordinate various activities. Very often, these tended to be church ladies of the zealot variety or professional organizer, types that like to run everyone else's lives that I never got along with very well. I loved my job, but I certainly didn't go to church 2 to 3 days a week. Once a month I'd do a rotation of one of the different offered services just so I'd know the faces and names a bit better. The vast majority of the military women close to my own age were either already married or divorced with children from multiple fathers, and I just didn't have the ambition to deal with that sort of life drama on a long-term basis. The never-married women tended to either have serious issues or were closeted lesbians. I most definitely didn't have the time or the inclination to start going back to the local C&W bars. Frankly, nearly every military divorce I helped counsel seemed to start with, "Well, I met her at a bar." I wanted to meet a woman and start a lifelong relationship, but I didn't want another Vicky. I wasn't quite living like a monk, but I certainly wasn't getting anything resembling regular sex either. With less than a month to go before my retirement, I was single, and without any plans for my life after retirement. I would get along all right on my retirement pay, and thought I'd stay in the area for a while and gently shop around to find a big church that I thought I could tolerate that needed a community affairs or youth group manager. I didn't get my hopes too high. Most of the churches in the region seemed to be either Southern Baptist or Catholic, and I was unlikely to be enough of a true believer to be hired and accepted. The remaining churches seemed to be of a nearly similar conservative bent that would probably require more quality time on my knees praying than I was used to spending, especially in retirement. A Behar County Social Services office had some interest in my experience, But as their civil service worked strictly on seniority for promotion and not merit, with no exceptions, I would be starting fairly low, near the bottom of their career ladder. I'd be spending my days handling crack babies and mothers. I didn't think I could manage much enthusiasm for doing that non-stop for very long, so I turned them down. Another job with the local United Way office wasn't much more promising, long hours / bad pay / insane office politics. But until I got a strange letter from a church in nearby Lovett, Texas that appeared to be my best opportunity. The church had provided me with some basic details, and they had a rudimentary website that gleaned a few more nuggets of information. For starters, this church, usually just called the church locally, was built exactly on the border of a large nudist colony. Well, technically half of the church aisles were clothing optional, and the other half fell on the prude side, but to 98% of the folks in the county, it didn't matter much. It was, by far, the largest church in the county and handled a great number of county civic projects more or less by default. I was inclined to dismiss them out of hand as cooks, but the more I read, the more fascinated I was with the extent of their duties. They managed the county food pantry for the poor, built homes for low-income families, and repaired the homes of seniors, provided free breakfast for children during the school year and lunches for low-income children during the summer months. They provided nearly all of the county crisis management services, hosted monthly job fairs, and weekly AA/Narcanon/anger management sessions. That they provided the usual church youth and scouting groups goes without saying. I was intrigued and really wanted to meet the head pastor, Benjamin or just Ben around town, who had the balls and the ambition to put all of that together. Lovett was indeed an odd place, so having a very odd church pastor didn't seem to be at all out of place. Father Ben was a very jovial man with a fat belly and a heart apparently even 3 sizes bigger. His age seemed to be indeterminate. He had first come to Lovett in the late 1960s, but he didn't seem to be any older in appearance than I was. Except for his dark eyes. They bored deep into your soul, and if you looked long and hard enough you could probably see eternity. The only eyes I ever saw that came close to his were on an old retired veteran of World War II who had been one of the early liberators of a death camp and had seen terrible things that could never be forgotten. He was looking for a top director of church services that would be responsible for everything the church handled outside of Sunday morning services. It was a huge job that could keep 5 people running nonstop from dawn until bedtime, assuming that the phone didn't ring at 3 a.m. If I were to be offered the position, I would have a staff of 2, a part-time motorcycle mechanic named Bronson, who handled most of the children's programs, and a longtime church secretary. The compensation offered for the position was beyond pitiful and bordered upon appalling, Ben admitted right from the very start of our interview. Money going to pay me couldn't be used to repair Widow Murphy's house next week, or provide the 8 Wallace children with lunch and something to take to their sick mother for their dinner. Frankly, the person they were ideally looking for wouldn't even have pay in their top 10 want items for the position. Job satisfaction had always been at least number 1 through number 5 for me anyway, and I could honestly agree with his viewpoint. They didn't want someone who viewed this as a job, but wanted someone that would probably do the work if asked, even for free, simply because it was important and needed to be done. Frankly, the job description kept changing weekly as they found more things that needed to be done that the poor county government didn't have the money to handle. As we talked, he questioned me deeper about my military career and my previous relationships, professional and intimate, with people. The questions grew harder, and it became increasingly impossible to hide any shading of the truth from him. Not that I had even considered any lies, of course. It was just odd that it was frankly quite impossible to sidestep or conceal anything other than the most utterly complete and fullest truth to my replies of the many complicated questions he asked me. What had I most liked and disliked about my chaplaincy jobs? The politics and dealing every day with people who had far worse problems than I had. I readily named all of my own perceived inadequacies and excoriating details, even mentioning that I had started off my career in law enforcement and left that work after nearly making a horrific mistake that haunted me for many years. At this he smiled at me kindly and asked the $50,000 question that I had been largely ignoring for over the last 15 years or so. Tell me about the worst pain that anyone has ever caused you, and did you ever forgive them for it? Oh dear God. I started to tell the story of my problem with my old OIC back at Security Hill, The bastard LT is a full colonel now, I hear. But before I knew it, I was telling the real story about my love for Vicky and her drug addiction and how she betrayed me. An hour later, when I finished the story, I was bawling in his office like a spanked schoolgirl. He had somehow peeled off every layer of protective scabbing I had built over the years, protecting my heart, which had also protected me from ever being able to want to love again. Now it was all gone, and the pain seemed like it had only just happened again yesterday. The answer was, of course, no. I had not forgiven her still to this day. Probably, I admitted, because I had never entirely lost the love that I had once had for her. This answer seemed to please him, and he replied, "But today, if she would walk into this room now, could you forgive her in your heart and begin to move on from there?" I don't know, and I didn't honestly know. I said all of the right sort of things that I wanted to and I should be able to and so on. But faced with a firm yes or no, I just couldn't make that decision then. The pain of the experience was as full as it had ever been in the past, and I was trapped once again by the raw emotion of the experience. Fine, that's a good honest answer anyway and will do for now. Let's talk about working with the folks that would be your staff, he said, and we hit on a great number of potential issues. Could I work okay with an ex-biker, Bronson, covered in tattoos that looked big and scary enough to break me with just his little finger, but was in actuality as gentle as a lamb? No problem. What about dealing with drug and alcohol addicts wanting to reform? Absolutely no problem. I gave him more details of my AA and Narconon work. Then we hit the last hurdle. So, if I were to tell you that our wonderfully outstanding church secretary, who has been with me for nearly 10 years and is utterly indispensable now, was once a serious drug abuser who willingly traded sex for drugs and became a convicted felon. She had stolen money from everyone around her, her family, her friends, and her lovers to buy drugs. She was also blackmailed by her drug dealers to do other awful things that she deeply regretted afterwards when sober. She reformed herself admirably in prison and is a sterling example to others now. I trust her with both my life and my checkbook. Can you do the same? Could you forgive her sordid past, which is now far in the past, and judge her only by what she does from today onwards? I thought for a moment and said, yes, I think so. I learned a lot over the years about the stupid things addicts do that hurt themselves and others, and I have only the greatest respect for folks that have pulled themselves out that abyss and make something of their lives afterwards. Good. Let me introduce you to our secretary, assuming you were to be offered the position and accept it. You can guess now, of course, that the church secretary was Vicky, or rather she used her full name these days, Victoria. We spent a moment or two avoiding each other's eyes and getting some good looks at the well-worn Persian rug on the floor of the Father Ben's office. At length we spoke and greeted each other by name and started to shake hands, but ended up hugging each other with tears in our eyes. That pretty much ended the interview. Ben said with a wink that it seemed that Victoria and I were old friends who had a lot of catching up now to do. We did for the next 4 hours at a wonderful old-fashioned diner, just down the road from the church within sight of the beach. She had been clean at the time we met, but the friends she was staying with were still using and providing a constant temptation to her. She weakened under stress and started to use a little to try and keep the edge off, which of course never works, and soon she was back to her old usage and habits. She needed money for drugs and was soon fired from her restaurant job for suspicion of theft. She had done it, but they couldn't prove it. My old roommate Jordan discovered her weakness and was amazed at how blind my love of her had made me. He first blackmailed her for sex to keep her drug use a secret from me, and then soon afterwards had her doing tricks for a local pimp for drug money, with Jordan getting a part of her cut to keep her secrets. By now, he was using and dealing himself, and his own judgment was getting quite impaired, such as agreeing to the theft of my credit card and wallet cash and joining her on that shopping spree. She didn't even know why she did it. I had never denied her anything. She was just quite out of her mind on drugs, doing terrible things with terrible people in a constant downward spiral towards the gutter, as the internal stress of trying to hide her unacceptable behavior to the man she loved and wanted to protect drove her virtually to the point of a nervous breakdown. She had loved me enough to avoid wanting to marry me because she was sure that since she was a full-fledged drug addict again eventually, she would do something terrible to hurt me, but had never expected me to find her with one of her pimps in that hotel. That was even far worse still, she realized much later. She knew that she should have come to me for help with the truth, but she loved me deeply and was frightened to death of losing the first real person that had genuinely cared for her. She was right. Faced with this awful truth in a San Antonio jail, I undoubtedly would not have forgiven her, and I certainly would have not taken her back into my heart of my life then, and probably would have said a great many words in anger I would have later regretted. Faced with this direct and ultimate rejection in turn, she would most likely have had little interest in rehabilitation and upon release from prison resumed a life of drug addiction and would probably now be a total crack and meth head, living under some bridge, recycling cans and giving $5 blowjobs. Instead, she avidly sought rehabilitation and left prison under parole after just a few years and began a new career of working in social services, helping other addicts. She found her way to the church a few years later by accident while on a trip and ever since made this place the center of her new life. She wasn't an avid nudist, nor did our jobs require us to be one, but it occasionally helped. I couldn't help but think to myself that she looked good and wouldn't mind one bit seeing her nude on the beach. We left friends, and for the first time in 16 years, my wounded heart had a proper bandage on it and it could begin to heal. The next Tuesday morning back at work in San Antonio, there was an official written job offer in my mailbox. Will I accept it? I'm 99% sure that this is where I'm supposed to be now in my life. But still that is not 100% sure, and I'll need to think about it for a few days. Ben says there is no rush at all if I need some time to decide. And I do. Have I forgiven Victoria? Yes, I think I have. Completely. Could I work with her though every day? That part is what I'm not so sure of. I know now that I still love her, and she still loves me. We seem to be waiting for all of these years, single and never married to anyone else. Maybe it's just supposed to happen and was always intended that way, but I need to be absolutely sure of myself. If I walk into that door, we will hug again like old lost but dear friends. We'd start doing lunches and dinners together. We'd start to hold hands, and sooner rather than later we'd kiss. Then there would be breakfasts together and marriage. Neither one of us is capable now of doing things just halfway. I need to make 100% sure that I can wake up in the morning and see only the woman I think I can love for the rest of my life and not ever see some horrible memory from the past. Can I make that definitive commitment yet? Not today. Probably not tomorrow either, nor likely during any of my remaining 3 weeks in uniform. But soon, after my retirement ceremony is over, and when I take off my uniform for the last time, I think that the last 1% undecided part of me will make that final choice for me, and I know I'll be able to live with it for the rest of my life.